By 1815, Britain had the skeleton of the great empire that was to develop during the 19th and 20th centuries. It had the remnants of its first great North American empire in modern-day Canada, and a foothold in Australasia. It also had an increasingly important economic stake in the Indian subcontinent, and was beginning to acquire territory in the Far East. Ceylon and the Cape had been taken from the Dutch, and there were stations on the West African coast, possessions in the Caribbean, and a scattering of other islands across the world. But compared to the empire of later years, it was still relatively small. This fledgling empire underwent an astonishing transformation during the course of the 19th century. By the early 1860s, Britain was ruling over roughly 175 million people. At its absolute peak, just after the First World War, the empire contained somewhere in the region of 450 million imperial subjects, roughly a quarter of the world's population. Canada had been fleshed out. Australia and New Zealand had developed dramatically. Huge territories had been acquired in Africa. The whole of the Indian subcontinent, in one way or another, was now blocked in red. Britain had taken over Burma and acquired a substantial Southeast Asian empire based on Malaysia and Singapore. It had become the largest empire in human history, but one that contained a bewildering array of parts. Protectorates, protected states, condominiums, crown colonies, all sorts of territory taken over to facilitate the Royal Navy, the Indian Empire, self-governing colonies, and eventually dominions, all of which had their own patterns of acquisition, forms of rule, and relationships to the mother country. This formal empire was by no means all of Britain's sphere of influence during the 19th century. Often at least as important as the places actually coloured pink on the map were countries that, although technically independent, were under such a degree of British influence that terms like informal empire or semi-colonies are thought appropriate. Places like Argentina and Chile, modern-day Iran, and much else in the Middle East, and big chunks of East and Southeast Asia, all found themselves at one time or another part of a British world system. This tremendous overseas expansion had been driven by two great forces. The first was the trading and commercial motive, the making of profitable links with other parts of the world, which only accelerated as industrial output increased during the course of the 19th century. The second was the unstoppable flow of emigrants from Britain, initially fleeing political or religious persecution, but later just seeking a better life. Economic migrants, we'd call them today, and they were to open up North America, Australasia and South Africa. From one perspective at least, that's what's most distinctive about the British Empire, the extent to which parts of it were to become colonies of settlement, that Britain, more than any other country in the world, exported people.
On the one hand, there are powerful forces, economic, political, social, ideological, driving outwards from the centre, from London, towards imperial expansion. On the other hand, this by no means always and necessarily dominates British policy making, British politics. Acquisitions of territory are sometimes apparently almost reluctant when the economic and other advantages of interaction with far-flung parts of the world were preferably to be obtained without the expense, the trouble, of actual conquest and formal political overrule. By no means each individual acquisition, each individual grab of a new bit of territory can be clearly and directly traced back to somebody in London saying, "We want that." Indeed, sometimes the policymakers in London are saying, "Damn it, there is so much trouble on that particular frontier as it stands that the only way we can get things under control," or indeed, quite often, especially in the late 19th century, the only way we can shut other potential imperialists out is to take physical, political control of it.
I think it's more the case of the British government picking up the pieces after some violent military clash around the next bend of the river, or some failure to get trade flowing through a particular area, or settlers getting into trouble. Like, for example, the British government intervenes twice in the first half of the 19th century in the so-called Maori Wars in New Zealand. That's because settlers were actually pushing their luck. They were taking land from the Maoris. They were having physical clashes with the Maoris, which they couldn't handle. And eventually Britain, sort of reluctantly, I think, because Victorian governments are terribly keen not to spend too much money, governments eventually do send support to places like New Zealand and, of course, South Africa eventually, and other various colonial outposts when the interests of British people and British trade and British commerce is apparently threatened. But it's often following on from some sort of crisis.
In some places, that's the dominant pattern, where existing or desired economic interests are already there and then political control follows. There are other cases, and this is true of much of tropical Africa, for instance, where the existing economic penetration is not great. It comes much more after imperial conquest that's happened for other reasons, and indeed often happens only quite late. Quite a lot of British Africa only really starts to be, quote, developed, or, if you prefer, intensively exploited economically in the very last years of the colonial era.
Leaving aside the settlement colonies, and a quite significant British community based in India, in much of the so-called subject empire, when it came to ruling over these societies, very few Britons were actually directly involved.
At the London end, it's mere handfuls of civil servants. Remember, both the Colonial Office and the separate India Office, for most of their careers, are really very small government departments. As for the men on the spot, the proconsuls, the district officers and commissioners, etc., these again in most cases are very small elites, often an individual, usually a very young man in fact, ruling over what might be hundreds of thousands of native subjects. Places that were coloured pink on the map over which the Union Jack was flying were not necessarily, especially not for much of the 19th century, really under effective British control. Local semi-autonomous power holders, local resistors often, might well in many cases continue to have considerable power. Far more areas of what was supposed to be British-controlled imperial possessions were actually effectively still semi-independent than is often remembered, so that really effective British control is quite often later than is thought and very short-lived before the tides of independence started to flow.
I worked out that for the middle of the 19th century, the number of actual governors of the empire, administrators, white people going out from Britain, as opposed to non-white people they found on the spot, was usually only about 2,000. And I think, I don't know, but I think, Hull City Council has probably got more than 2,000 people running it, which either means that Hull is particularly full of rebellious natives and so forth and needs that number of people looking after them, or that the British Empire was really very lightly governed on the whole.
In some colonised societies, recognising and seeking to work with, if you like, to prop up local aristocracies and monarchies and so on, is a very established mode of imperial rule. What's often called indirect rule. Keep the local potentate, king, chief, emir, sheikh, raja, in place on his throne, and you, the colonial administrator, the district officer or whatever, be the power behind the throne. The thinking, of course, amongst other things, is that this is usually a cheaper and less resistance-provoking way of ruling a colony than a more direct, interventionist kind of overrule. The ideological thing, or the romanticism as it's sometimes seen, of applauding aristocracies, whether they were Indian or Nigerian or whatever, just as if supposedly they were British aristocracies, can be overdone. There's a much more hard-headed calculation. Ruling through these people certainly saves money and may save blood, British blood.
In the first half of the century, British power had expanded relatively unchallenged. Its main European rivals were much more concerned with consolidating land on the continent than they were in establishing colonies overseas. But Britain's dominant position was underpinned not by its superior military might, but by its overwhelming naval supremacy. Battleships could be sent to bombard a port, overawe a prince, or intimidate a local population, without the need for large numbers of troops on the ground. It was, in a way, empire on the cheap.
The British Standing Army was about 250,000 men. And if you scatter them around a global empire, which is roughly a quarter of the world, they're going to be pretty thin on the ground. But the standing armies were, of course, there, particularly on the Indian subcontinent. The British were able to recruit very large numbers of Indians and deploy them all around the world. The only time they hesitated about that was in South Africa, due to the sensitivity, if you could put it that way, racial prejudice might be a better way of putting it, of the Afrikaner majority amongst the white population in South Africa. But elsewhere, Indians are sent off to crush the emperor of Ethiopia. They're sent to open up territory in Southeast Asia. They protect the frontiers of India itself. And of course, when the war breaks out in 1914, they are sent in large numbers, even to the Western Front.
The empire was a patchwork quilt of extraordinarily varied kinds of territory, kinds of control, and means of acquisition. Sometimes this involves treaties, Britain establishing things that are called, for instance, protectorates, where the fiction, and it is usually rather a fiction, is that the local people, or at least the local rulers, have invited the British in to protect them. But much more often than not, it involves violence, it involves conquest. Sometimes extreme violence, sometimes, as early on in parts of the Americas and much later Australasia, it involves something at least close to genocide of indigenous peoples.